The global transition to offshore wind is colliding with a hard physical limit. High-voltage direct current subsea cables have become the primary bottleneck for grid integration. By 2026, annual global demand will reach 24.5 gigawatt kilometers. Maximum manufacturing capacity will sit at just 9.8 gigawatt kilometers. This represents a deficit of 150%. Cumulative supply deficit through 2030 will exceed 110 gigawatt kilometers. This shortfall directly threatens the integration of over 65 gigawatts of planned offshore wind power. Capital allocation cannot resolve this bottleneck. Building a new manufacturing facility requires a minimum of 36 months. This timeline is dictated by the engineering requirements of vertical extrusion towers and high-voltage testing qualification. This capacity deficit has triggered an operational crisis for developers. Average lead times for subsea cables have escalated from 1.8 years in 2018 to 6.2 years in 2026. Projects bidding today cannot secure transmission assets until the next decade. This delay introduces severe capital risks. The financial backlog reflects this structural squeeze. The combined order book of the three dominant European producers has reached 34 billion euros. This is a 141% increase from 2022 levels. Simultaneously, maritime logistics are constrained. Daily charter rates for specialized subsea cable-laying vessels now exceed $150,000. The global fleet contains fewer than 15 of these high-capacity vessels. The supply chain is highly vulnerable to single points of failure. 3 European manufacturers control 80% of global high-voltage subsea cable production. This extreme geographic concentration is mirrored in the upstream chemical supply. Just 2 companies, Borealis and Dow, control over 90% of global high-purity insulation polymer production. This polymer is critical for extra-high voltage cross-linked polyethylene insulation. Any disruption at these chemical plants halts the entire global grid transition. Furthermore, geopolitical barriers prevent Western grids from utilizing Chinese manufacturing capacity. This regulatory isolation ensures that the subsea cable bottleneck will remain a rigid constraint on decarbonization for the foreseeable future. The commercial deployment of next-generation, small modular reactors is constrained by a critical fuel bottleneck. High-assay low-enriched uranium, or HALEU, is enriched between 5 and 20% uranium-235. This higher enrichment is thermodynamically necessary for smaller reactor cores. From 2020 through 2022, Russia's state-owned enterprise Tenex held an absolute commercial monopoly. It maintained a steady nominal capacity of 20.0 metric tons of heavy metal per year. Western alternatives did not exist at commercial scale. Domestic United States production only began in late 2023. Centrus Energy deployed a 16-machine demonstration cascade in Piketon, Ohio, yielding an initial 0.1 metric tons. By 2026, combined Western capacity is projected to reach 14.0 metric tons, leaving a 30% deficit compared to Russia. Supply lag creates a severe structural deficit for Western utilities. The gap between planned reactor deployments and fuel availability peaks in 2028. In that year, projected Western demand of 120.0 metric tons will outstrip domestic supply of 45.0 metric tons by 62.5%. This deficit is locked in by regulatory and physical lead times. Facilities handling uranium enriched above 5% require Category 2 special nuclear material licenses. Securing these permits imposes a minimum 3 to 5 year administrative delay. By 2032, aggressive capacity additions will bring Western supply to 290.0 metric tons per year. However, projected demand will reach 450.0 metric tons. This leaves a persistent structural deficit of 160.0 metric tons per year. The bottleneck is governed by the nonlinear physics of uranium enrichment. Producing high-assay fuel is not a simple extension of standard operations. Yielding 1 kilogram of 19.75% HALEU requires 56.24 separative work units, a 637% increase in effort compared to standard 4.5% low-enriched uranium. Raw material consumption scales with similar inefficiency. The natural uranium feed requirement rises from 8.41 kilograms for standard fuel to 38.26 kilograms for HALEU, a 355% increase in raw uranium input. Furthermore, the physical process time factor scales to 7.37 times the baseline. Converting existing centrifuge cascades to HALEU production drastically reduces total volumetric output. The Western nuclear transition cannot bypass these thermodynamic limits. The Malacca Strait is approaching its physical and operational limits. By 2030, annual vessel transits will reach 107,800. This exceeds the safe operational capacity of 100,000 transits by 7.8%. This congestion causes exponential delays. Average transit delays will rise to 48.5 hours by 2030. This represents a 166% increase in idle time and fuel burn since 2016. Physical constraints compound these traffic delays. The Phillips Channel has a strict draft limit of 20 meters. Vessels drawing over 18 meters must reduce cargo loads or reroute through the Sunda or Lombok Straits. This detour adds up to 1,200 nautical miles to the voyage. Thailand has proposed a $28 billion land bridge across the Kra Isthmus to bypass this choke point. However, multimodal transshipment introduces severe cost penalties. Small feeder vessels of 3,000 units save 2.4 days but face a 72.2% cost increase. For larger vessels, the land bridge is entirely unviable. An ultra-large container vessel of 24,000 units faces a net time loss of 0.7 days. The time required to unload and reload 24,000 containers exceeds the time saved by bypassing the strait. Furthermore, the transit cost per unit triples. It rises from $65 via the strait to $195 via the land bridge. This cost penalty prevents major alliance carriers from adopting the route. The financial structure of the project reflects its physical complexity. Port infrastructure dominates the capital requirements. The Ranong and Chumphon deep-sea ports require a combined $18.4 billion, representing 65.7% of the total budget. The Overland Transit Corridor requires an additional $7 billion. This 90-kilometer link of dual-track railway and expressway is designed to handle 20 million units annually. However, the capital intensity creates a high financial hurdle. To amortize this investment over a 30-year period, the land bridge must capture 15% of Malacca Strait container traffic. It must do so while charging a premium tariff rate. Given the cost penalties for large vessels, this volume target remains highly unrealistic. The global high-tech supply chain is transitioning toward extreme geographic concentration. Helium extraction is shifting away from historically secure domestic United States reserves. By 2026, the United States' share of global production will fall to 24.2%. This decline is driven by reserve depletion and the privatization of the Federal Helium Reserve. Qatar and Russia are capturing this displaced market share. Qatar is now the single largest producer, projected to supply 72 million cubic meters by 2026. Simultaneously, Russia is scaling its Amur gas processing plant to 28 million cubic meters. Together, these two non-Western nations will control over 60% of global helium capacity. This concentration exposes advanced semiconductor and quantum computing manufacturing to severe geopolitical risks. Pricing economics of cryogenic cooling are structurally destabilized. For decades, the United States Federal Helium Reserve in Cliffside, Texas, acted as the global market buffer. Between 2012 and 2024, this inventory depleted by 97.3%. The final privatization sale in 2024 marked the end of this state-managed safety net. This depletion has triggered an exponential price escalation. Bulk liquid helium prices have risen from $84 per thousand cubic feet in 2012 to an estimated $850 in 2026. This represents a 911.9% increase. With zero active reserve inventory remaining by 2026, the market has lost its capacity to absorb supply shocks. End users now face immediate, unbuffered spot market volatility. The demand side of the helium market is highly rigid. The industries driving advanced computing, aerospace, and healthcare have almost no capacity to substitute helium with alternative gases. Magnetic resonance imaging, semiconductor lithography, and quantum research collectively command 62% of global demand. Purity requirements further complicate the supply chain. Semiconductor manufacturing and quantum computing require grade 6.0 helium. This 99.9999% purity level requires highly specialized, capital-intensive liquefaction infrastructure. For quantum computing and basic scientific research, the substitution index is absolute zero. No other element can remain liquid at the sub-1 Kelvin temperatures required to maintain qubit coherence. This physical reality binds the future of advanced computing to a highly volatile, geographically concentrated supply chain. Global agricultural yields depend on a single, non-substitutable mineral. Phosphorus cannot be synthesized. Over 70% of the world's remaining sedimentary phosphate rock is concentrated in Morocco and the contested Western Sahara. This creates an unprecedented geopolitical single point of failure for the global food supply. The world's largest agricultural producers are rapidly depleting their domestic reserves. China produces 90 million metric tons annually, but holds less than 5% of global reserves. At current extraction rates, China faces complete domestic depletion in under 36 years. The United States is in a similar structural decline. American reserves have fallen to just 1 billion metric tons, representing 1.4% of the global total. This resource exhaustion has already forced domestic fertilizer manufacturers to transition from net exporters to net importers of raw phosphate rock. Primary bottleneck in fertilizer production is not the raw rock, but the sulfuric acid required to process it. Historically, sulfur has been an abundant, low-cost byproduct of oil and gas refining. This link creates a profound paradox for the green transition. As the world decarbonizes, refining volumes contract, directly choking off the sulfur supply. Byproduct sulfur from hydrocarbon refining currently accounts for nearly 64% of global supply. Under moderate decarbonization pathways, this supply will contract by over 42% by 2040. This represents a drop to 31.5 million metric tons. This contraction will generate a structural deficit of over 36 million metric tons of sulfur, equivalent by 2040. Bypassing this deficit requires a return to highly polluting, capital-intensive direct pyritic mining. Without this transition, global fertilizer production will face immediate physical limits. The physical constraints of rock and acid translate directly into food price inflation. Producing 1 metric ton of diammonium phosphate fertilizer requires a fixed input of 1.6 tons of rock and 2.7 tons of sulfuric acid. This chemical ratio makes fertilizer costs highly sensitive to acid pricing. A $100 increase in the price of sulfuric acid raises the production cost of fertilizer by $270 per ton. This is a higher sensitivity than an equivalent price spike in raw phosphate rock. The economics of agriculture are therefore bound to industrial chemical markets. If both inputs reach $250 per ton, the baseline production cost of fertilizer escalates to $1,235 per metric ton. This is a 171% increase over the historical baseline. This cost escalation cannot be bypassed by financial engineering, posing a direct threat to global crop yields. A global transition to liquefied natural gas is colliding with a hard physical limit in maritime construction. In 2024, the active order book for LNG carriers peaked at 360 vessels. This represents a 200% increase from the 2018 baseline. Shipyards cannot scale to meet this demand. Annual delivery capacity is physically capped at approximately 95 to 100 vessels. The ceiling is dictated by the limited number of dry docks equipped for cryogenic containment installation. Consequently, lead times have more than doubled. A standard 174,000 cubic meter carrier now requires 62 months from contract to delivery. This structural delay locks in high transport costs for the rest of the decade. The construction of these vessels is concentrated in a highly localized duopoly. South Korea and China control over 97% of global LNG carrier manufacturing. This extreme concentration exposes energy security to regional industrial disruptions. China is rapidly expanding its footprint through state-backed shipyards. Its market share is projected to reach 40% by 2028, up from just 10% in 2018. This expansion challenges South Korea's historical dominance. The barrier to entry remains exceptionally high. New builders must secure proprietary licenses for membrane technology. Furthermore, the industry faces a severe global deficit of certified cryogenic invar welders. This labor constraint prevents other nations from entering the market. Physical constraints have driven asset prices and shipping rates to historic highs. The cost of a newbuild carrier rose 50% to $270 million by 2025. This escalation reflects both rising material costs and premium pricing for scarce dry dock slots. Charter markets mirror this structural tightness. Average one-year charter rates remain elevated at $115,000 per day. This is far above the pre-crisis average of $75,000. These high transport costs directly inflate the landed price of natural gas. The crisis is also spilling over into other maritime sectors. High-margin LNG orders have crowded out dry docks historically used for oil tankers and bulk carriers. This displacement is triggering a secondary capacity squeeze, delaying broader maritime decarbonization. Global steel industry cannot easily transition away from coal. Primary steelmaking via the blast furnace route still accounts for over 68% of global output. This maintains a rigid baseline demand of over 1 billion tons of metallurgical coal annually. Alternative pathways face severe physical constraints. The direct reduced iron pathway is projected to grow through 2030, yet it will represent less than 10% of global production. Electric arc furnaces are similarly restricted. The global supply of high-quality, low-copper steel scrap is growing at less than 2.5% annually due to long product life cycles. The transition to direct reduced iron is bottlenecked by geology. This process requires ultra-high-grade iron ore pellets containing over 67% iron. Currently, these premium pellets constitute less than 5% of global iron ore supply. Planned processing plants face an immediate raw material deficit. This structural deficit will widen to 50 million tons by 2030. This represents a 24% shortfall in required feedstock. Upgrading lower-grade ores to meet these specifications is highly inefficient. The process incurs severe energy penalties and capital costs as yields drop exponentially below a feed grade of 62% iron. Primary steelmaking remains vulnerable to extreme geographic concentration. Australia's Bowen Basin controls over 50% of the global seaborne premium hard coking coal market. This concentration exposes global supply chains to immediate climate and logistical shocks. Weather disruptions in Queensland regularly trigger supply contractions of 10 to 15%. These deficits rapidly drive spot prices above $400 per ton. Alternative producers in North America cannot mitigate these shocks. High extraction costs and rail bottlenecks prevent a rapid supply response, locking in coal dependency for decades.